At exactly 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996, a phone call was made from the Ramsey residence at 755 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless, verging on hysterical. Patsy Ramsey screamed into the phone that there had been a kidnapping. Her 6-year-old daughter JonBenét was missing. There was a ransom note. The dispatcher asked basic questions, trying to calm the panicked mother, trying to get information that could help. Had she checked the entire house? Yes, Patsy said. Was anyone else in the home? Her husband John and their son Burke. The call lasted less than 2 minutes before it was supposed to disconnect. But it didn't disconnect. Not completely. And what happened in those final seconds would haunt this investigation for nearly 3 decades. When audio experts enhanced the recording years later, using technology that wasn't available in 1996, they discovered something the Ramseys had hoped would remain buried. Voices. Multiple voices in the background after Patsy thought she had hung up. A male voice that sounded like John Ramsey. And then something even more damning. A child's voice. High-pitched, questioning. Before we go further into what that recording revealed, make sure you subscribe to the Case Files Collective and hit that notification bell. We bring you the cases that demand answers, the investigations that refuse to stay buried. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? What's the weather like today? Your engagement keeps these investigations alive. Enhanced analysis suggested the voice was asking, "What did you find?" Investigators brought in multiple experts who all reached the same conclusion. That was Burke Ramsey's voice. This was a problem. A massive problem. Because John and Patsy Ramsey had told police that Burke, their 9-year-old son, was asleep in his bedroom when Patsy discovered the ransom note. They claimed he slept through the 911 call, through the panic, through the police arriving. They said they didn't wake him because they wanted to protect him from the trauma of what was happening. But that background audio told a different story. Burke wasn't asleep. He was awake. He was downstairs with his parents. And he was asking questions about what they had found. If Burke was awake, then the entire timeline the Ramseys presented to police began to crumble. If he was downstairs asking questions, then he knew something had happened before that call was made. And if the family was willing to lie about whether their son was awake or asleep, what else were they lying about? Boulder, Colorado in 1996 was the kind of place where success was worn like a badge of honor. Nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, it was home to tech entrepreneurs, university professors, and families who had made it. The Ramseys were one of those families. On the surface, they had everything the American dream promised. John Ramsey was a self-made millionaire, the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had just crossed the billion-dollar revenue mark. His net worth was estimated at over $6 million. He was respected in the business community, known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. Patsy Ramsey was a former beauty queen who had won the Miss West Virginia title in 1977. She had traded the pageant stage for motherhood, pouring her energy into raising their 2 children and maintaining their position in Boulder's social circles. She was active in their church, organized charity events, and kept their 15-room Tudor mansion immaculate. To neighbors and friends, Patsy seemed devoted to her family, especially to 6-year-old JonBenét, who had followed in her mother's footsteps into the world of child beauty pageants. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was a striking child with blonde hair and a smile that lit up every stage she performed on. She had won multiple pageant titles, including Little Miss Colorado and National Tiny Miss Beauty. Videos from those pageants would later become some of the most watched and debated footage in true crime history. She sang, she danced, she posed with the confidence of someone much older. Some saw a talented child living her dream. Others saw something more disturbing, a 6-year-old made up to look like an adult, performing in ways that made them uncomfortable. Burke, their 9-year-old son, was quieter, more reserved. He seemed content to stay in the background while his sister commanded attention. By all accounts, he was a normal kid who liked video games and playing with his friends. The family also included John Andrew and Melinda, John's children from his first marriage, though they didn't live in the Boulder home. What people saw was perfection. What they didn't see was whatever happened behind closed doors on Christmas night. The Ramseys spent Christmas Day 1996 the way many affluent families do, visiting friends and celebrating the holiday season. They attended a dinner party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends who lived nearby in Boulder. According to everyone present that evening, nothing seemed unusual. The family appeared relaxed and happy. JonBenét played with Burke and the other children at the party. She was excited about Christmas, talking about the gifts she had received that morning. John and Patsy mingled with other guests, discussing holiday plans and the usual small talk that fills these gatherings. They left the White residence around 9:30 that evening. John would later tell police that JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car during the short drive home. He said he carried her from the vehicle into the house and took her straight upstairs to her bedroom. She was still wearing the clothes she had worn to the party. He didn't change her into pajamas. He simply laid her in bed and left her there. Patsy claimed she checked on JonBenét around 10 that evening and everything was fine. The little girl was sleeping peacefully. After that, according to their account, everyone went to bed. It had been a long day and they had plans to fly to their vacation home in Michigan early the next morning. That was the story. Simple. Straightforward. Unremarkable. JonBenét went to bed and never woke up. Sometime during the night, an intruder must have broken into their home, written a ransom note, taken JonBenét from her bed, and murdered her in the basement. But there was a problem with this narrative. Actually, there were several problems. And they all started with a bowl of pineapple. During the autopsy performed on December 27, medical examiners found partially digested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach and upper intestine. Based on the rate of digestion, experts determined she had eaten that pineapple somewhere between 1 to 2 hours before her death. This was crucial information because it directly contradicted what John and Patsy had told investigators. If JonBenét had been carried straight to bed asleep and never woke up, when did she eat the pineapple? The Ramseys insisted they hadn't given her any food after returning home from the party. They said she was asleep and remained asleep. But in the kitchen of the Ramsey home, police found a white bowl sitting on the table. Inside that bowl was pineapple with a serving spoon. When investigators processed the bowl for fingerprints, they found prints belonging to Burke and Patsy. Not JonBenét's prints. Just Burke's and Patsy's. So someone had prepared or served that pineapple. Someone in the family had been in the kitchen with that bowl. And somehow, JonBenét had eaten from it within hours of her death. The timeline the parents presented was already falling apart, and investigators were just getting started. When Patsy Ramsey came down the spiral staircase at 5:52 that morning, she claimed she found a ransom note laid out on the steps. Not crumpled in a corner. Not slipped under a door. Laid out deliberately where it couldn't possibly be missed. The note itself would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in American criminal history, and for good reason. It made absolutely no sense if you believed an actual kidnapper had written it. The note was 2.5 pages long. Ransom notes in legitimate kidnapping cases are typically brief. Kidnappers want to communicate their demands quickly and get out. They don't stick around writing essays. But this note rambled on with unnecessary details and bizarre phrasing. It began with, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully." It claimed to be from a group of individuals that represented a small foreign faction. It stated that they respected John's business but not the country it served, a phrase that sounded like it came from a movie rather than actual criminals. The writer claimed they were a group of individuals, yet kept switching between "we" and "I" throughout the note, suggesting confusion about whether this was supposed to be one person or multiple people. The ransom demand was perhaps the strangest detail. $118,000. Not 100,000. Not $500,000. Not $1 million, which is what you might expect kidnappers to demand from a family worth over $6 million. $118,000. That exact figure. And here's what made investigators immediately suspicious. $118,000 was the exact amount of the bonus John Ramsey had recently received from Access Graphics. It wasn't public information. It wasn't something a stranger would know. It was insider knowledge, the kind of detail only someone very close to the family would have. The note went on to provide instructions for delivering the ransom. It told John to be well rested because he would be traveling. It warned him not to contact police or tell anyone, or his daughter would be beheaded. It mentioned that they would call him between 8 and 10 a.m. to give him instructions for the delivery. The tone shifted throughout, sometimes threatening, sometimes almost conversational. It referenced movies, using phrases that sounded like they'd been pulled from Hollywood thrillers rather than real criminal communications. But perhaps the most damning evidence about the note wasn't what it said, but how it was written. The pad of paper it was written on came from inside the Ramsey house. It was a pad that Patsy used for making notes and lists. The pen used to write it also came from inside the house and had been placed back in its holder in the kitchen after the note was finished. And when investigators examined that notepad more closely, they found something extraordinary. Practice drafts. Someone had started writing the ransom note, stopped, and started over. The first attempt began with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey before being crossed out. The second attempt, the one left on the stairs, started with just Mr. Ramsey. This wasn't a kidnapper who broke in and quickly scrawled a note. This was someone who had time. Someone who felt comfortable enough in that house to sit down, write, make mistakes, start over, and perfect their ransom note. When Boulder police officers Linda Arndt and Rick French arrived at the Ramsey residence at 5:59 a.m., just 7 minutes after the 911 call, they expected to find a distraught family waiting for them in a secured location. Instead, they walked into chaos. Friends and family were already arriving at the house. Fleet White, John's close friend, was there. Reverend Roll Hoverstock from the family's church showed up shortly after. More people kept coming throughout the morning. The house that should have been treated as a crime scene was instead filling up with well-meaning visitors who had no idea they were potentially destroying evidence with every step they took. This was the first critical failure in an investigation that would be plagued by mistakes from the beginning. The officers on scene made a decision that would haunt the case for decades. They treated this as a kidnapping, not a murder. In their minds, JonBenét had been taken from the home by an intruder. The ransom note said kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. So they waited for that call. They didn't seal off the house. They didn't establish a perimeter. They didn't stop people from walking through rooms, using bathrooms, touching surfaces, sitting on furniture. The crime scene was being contaminated in real time and nobody seemed to realize the magnitude of what was being lost. Officer Rick French did conduct an initial search of the house shortly after arriving. He went room by room, checking closets, looking under beds, opening doors. He made his way down to the basement, a confusing maze of storage areas and small rooms. He came to a door in the basement, the door to the wine cellar, a small windowless room with a wooden door secured by a simple latch. He later testified that he tried the door and found it latched from the outside. He didn't force it open. He moved on to search other areas. Behind that latched door, JonBenét was already there. Already dead. Already positioned in a way that would fuel decades of speculation about what really happened in those dark hours. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. 8 a.m. came and went. No call from the kidnappers. 9 a.m. passed. Still nothing. 10 a.m., the deadline mentioned in the ransom note, came and went with silence. John Ramsey paced through the house, making phone calls, talking to friends. Patsy was described by those present as hysterical. Her doctor had been called and arrived at the house to give her sedatives. Detective Linda Arndt was growing increasingly uneasy. She had asked for backup hours earlier but was told none was available. She was alone in a house full of people, in what she believed was a kidnapping that wasn't following any normal pattern. At around 1 p.m., Detective Arndt made a decision that would change everything. She asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house again, top to bottom, to see if they could find anything the police had missed. John and Fleet started in the basement. They checked the train room where Burke played. They looked through storage areas. And then John walked to that wine cellar door. The same door that Officer French had found latched at 6 a.m. John reached for the latch and opened it. What happened next was captured in his immediate scream that echoed through the house. Fleet White heard John scream and ran to the wine cellar doorway. There in the darkness of that small basement room, JonBenét's body lay on the concrete floor. She was wearing a white long-sleeved shirt and white long johns. Around her neck was a white cord, tied and twisted into a garrote with a broken paintbrush handle inserted into it. The paintbrush had come from Patsy's art supplies. Her mouth was covered with duct tape. Her hands were tied loosely above her head with more white cord. A white blanket lay nearby. Someone had wrapped her in it at some point. John Ramsey did something in that moment that would complicate the investigation even further and raise questions about his behavior for years to come. He didn't leave the scene undisturbed. He didn't call for police to come down and document everything exactly as it was. He walked into that room, removed the duct tape from his daughter's mouth, untied the cords binding her hands, and picked up her body. He carried her upstairs, away from the crime scene, away from any chance investigators had of properly processing the evidence. Detective Arndt saw him emerge from the basement carrying JonBenét. The little girl's body was rigid with rigor mortis. She had clearly been dead for hours. Arndt would later testify about that moment in chilling terms. She said she looked into John Ramsey's eyes and she knew. She never fully explained what she meant by that statement, but her testimony suggested that in that instant, she believed the family was involved in whatever had happened to JonBenét. John laid his daughter's body on the floor in the hallway near the Christmas tree. The remaining detective, the friends, the family members all saw her there. But it was too late. Whatever evidence had been in that wine cellar, whatever the crime scene might have told investigators, had been compromised. John had moved the body. He had touched the tape, the cords, his daughter's clothing. The basement had been walked through multiple times by that point. Any chance of isolating specific DNA, fingerprints, or trace evidence had been severely damaged. The coroner didn't arrive until 8 p.m. that evening. JonBenét's body had been lying in that hallway for hours. The autopsy was conducted the next day, December 27th, and what it revealed painted a horrifying picture of the last moments of that little girl's life. The official cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation associated with cranial cerebral trauma. She had been struck in the head with tremendous force, causing a skull fracture that spread 8.5 inches across her skull. The blow had caused immediate brain swelling and massive internal bleeding. Some experts believe this injury alone would have been fatal within hours even without medical intervention. But here's what made the medical evidence so disturbing. JonBenét wasn't dead when the strangulation occurred. The head blow came first. It would have rendered her unconscious immediately, but her heart was still beating. Her body was still fighting to survive. And at some point after that devastating head injury, someone fashioned a garrote from a broken paintbrush and cord. Someone twisted that cord around her neck tight enough to leave a deep furrow in her skin. The evidence of petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, the marks on her neck, the way her body had responded to oxygen deprivation, all of it proved she was still alive when that garrote was applied and tightened. Someone had waited. Someone had taken their time. And then someone had finished what the head blow had started. Of all the evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case, one piece stands out as the most simple yet devastating contradiction to the family's account of that night. A bowl of pineapple. It seems almost absurd that something so ordinary could become so critical, but that bowl sitting on the Ramsey kitchen table told a story the family didn't want told. It exposed their timeline as fiction. It proved someone was lying about what happened after they returned home from the Christmas party. The bowl was white, unremarkable, with chunks of fresh pineapple and a large serving spoon inside. It was sitting on the wooden kitchen table when police processed the scene. When investigators sent that bowl for fingerprint analysis, they found prints belonging to Burke Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. Not JonBenét's fingerprints, which was strange if she had eaten from it. Just Burke's and Patsy's. So at some point that evening or early morning, Burke and Patsy had both handled that bowl. Someone had prepared or served that pineapple. Someone had gotten out a bowl, put pineapple in it, grabbed a spoon from the drawer, and placed it on the table. But according to John and Patsy's statement to police, none of that happened. They said JonBenét fell asleep in the car on the way home from the party. They said John carried her inside and put her straight to bed without even changing her out of her clothes. They said she never woke up after that. They insisted no one ate anything after returning home. Everyone just went to bed because they had an early flight the next morning. Their story was clear and consistent. JonBenét went to sleep and never got up. Except the autopsy said otherwise. The pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach and duodenum had been eaten between 1 to 2 hours before her death. The digestion rate didn't lie. That pineapple was fresh in her system. She had eaten it in that house, likely from that bowl, in the hours before she died. So how did it get there if she never woke up? How did she eat pineapple if she was carried straight to bed and never came back downstairs? The story didn't add up. It couldn't add up. Because at least one part of it was a lie. Investigators pushed the family on this discrepancy. Could JonBenét have woken up and come downstairs on her own? Could she have gotten the pineapple herself? The Ramseys had no good answer. They maintained their version of events even as the evidence contradicted it. Some experts theorized that Burke had been up eating pineapple, maybe playing with his new Christmas toys, and JonBenét had come downstairs and joined him. Maybe she took some pineapple from his bowl. Maybe that's when whatever happened between them happened. But the family never acknowledged any of this. They stuck to their story. And that bowl of pineapple became a symbol of everything wrong with their account, a simple piece of fruit that destroyed their carefully constructed timeline. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old on Christmas night 1996. He was the only other person in that house besides his parents and his sister. And for 20 years, he said almost nothing publicly about what happened. That silence, combined with other aspects of his behavior, made him a focus of speculation and investigation that would follow him into adulthood. The question that haunted investigators was simple but profound. What did Burke know? What did Burke see? And was Burke involved? In the immediate aftermath of JonBenét's death, Burke's behavior struck some people as odd. When police interviewed him in the days following the murder, officers noted his effect seemed unusual for a child whose sister had just been killed. He appeared unconcerned, detached, almost cheerful at times when discussing what had happened. He smiled inappropriately. He seemed more interested in talking about his video games than his sister. But child psychology experts were divided on what this meant. Some said it was suspicious, a sign of guilty knowledge or involvement. Others argued it was completely normal for a 9-year-old boy in shock, a child's way of coping with trauma too large to process. The physical evidence raised questions too. Burke's fingerprints were on that bowl of pineapple. The enhanced 911 call suggested he was awake and downstairs when the call was made, despite his parents claiming he was asleep. Some investigators theorized that Burke and JonBenét had been up together that night. Maybe they were in the kitchen. Maybe they got into an argument over something trivial, the way siblings do. Maybe over a toy. Maybe over that bowl of pineapple. And maybe in a moment of anger, Burke had struck his sister with something heavy. A flashlight perhaps. Or another object that could generate enough force to create that devastating skull fracture. Could a 9-year-old generate that much force? Experts disagreed sharply on this point. Some said absolutely, especially if he used a heavy object and swung it with enough momentum. They pointed out that children can be capable of surprising strength when angry or acting impulsively. Others argued the amount of force required suggested an adult, that a child simply couldn't hit hard enough to create that kind of catastrophic injury. The debate continued for years with no definitive answer. But what investigators found most compelling wasn't whether Burke could have caused the head injury. It was what happened after. The theory that gained the most traction among those who worked the case went like this. Burke strikes JonBenét, possibly by accident, possibly in anger. She falls. She's unconscious. Burke panics and gets his parents. John and Patsy come downstairs and find their daughter unresponsive with a severe head injury. They face an impossible decision. If they call 911, Burke will be taken into custody. There will be investigations, social services, possibly criminal charges even if it was an accident. Their family will be destroyed. Their reputation ruined. Everything they've built will collapse. So they make a different choice. They decide to stage a kidnapping gone wrong. They decide to protect their son at all costs. This theory explains the ransom note. It explains why Patsy had time to write and rewrite it using materials from inside the house. It explains the garrote, created as staging to make it look like an intruder murder. It explains why there was no forced entry, because there was no intruder. It explains why the family immediately hired lawyers and refused to cooperate with police, because they had something to hide. And it explains the grand jury indictment that wouldn't be revealed for 14 years. In 1998, Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to hear evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case. For 13 months, from September 1998 to October 1999, the grand jury met in secret. They examined over 30,000 pieces of evidence. They heard testimony from dozens of witnesses including police officers, forensic experts, handwriting analysts, child psychologists, and medical examiners. They reviewed crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and police interviews. They listened to the enhanced 911 call. They studied the ransom note. They analyzed the pineapple evidence, the contaminated crime scene, and the family's contradictory statements. It was one of the most comprehensive grand jury investigations in Colorado history. On October 13, 1999, the grand jury reached their decision. District Attorney Alex Hunter called a press conference. The media gathered, expecting to hear that indictments were being handed down. Instead, Hunter announced there was insufficient evidence to file charges against anyone. He said the grand jury had returned a no bill, which in legal terms means they didn't find enough evidence to indict. The case would remain open, he said, but no one would be prosecuted at that time. The public was told the grand jury had examined everything and concluded they couldn't prove who killed JonBenét Ramsey. But that was a lie. A lie that would stand for 14 years until a reporter and the Boulder Daily Camera newspaper fought to have the grand jury documents unsealed. In 2013, a judge ordered the release of the true bills of indictment. What they revealed shocked everyone who had followed the case. The grand jury hadn't voted no bill at all. They had voted to indict John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. Not for murder directly, but for 2 counts each that were in some ways even more damning. Count 4 against each parent stated they did unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey, a child under the age of 16. Count 7 stated they did render assistance to a person, with intent to hinder, delay and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted has committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. Read those charges carefully. The grand jury believed John and Patsy Ramsey had allowed their daughter to be placed in a dangerous situation that resulted in her death. And they believed the parents had helped someone avoid prosecution for murder and child abuse. They believed the Ramseys knew who killed JonBenét and had actively worked to prevent that person from being caught, charged, and convicted. The indictment didn't name who that person was. It didn't have to. The only other person in the house that night was Burke. The grand jury had concluded that someone in that house killed JonBenét Ramsey, and her parents had covered it up. Alex Hunter had the indictments in his hands. He had the grand jury's finding that probable cause existed to charge both parents. But he chose not to sign them. He claimed the evidence wasn't strong enough to win at trial. He said he had an ethical obligation not to bring charges unless he was confident of securing a conviction. But many people, including investigators who worked the case, believed something else. They believed Hunter didn't want to prosecute a wealthy, well-connected family unless he had an absolutely airtight case. They believed he was more concerned with his political future than with justice for JonBenét. In 2008, 9 years after the grand jury's secret indictment and 2 years after Patsy Ramsey died from ovarian cancer, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey made a stunning announcement. She was officially exonerating the Ramsey family. Her reasoning centered on DNA evidence that had been found on JonBenét's clothing. Touch DNA on the waistband of her long johns and on her underwear didn't match any family member. That DNA had been entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but had never produced a match. Lacey sent the Ramseys a letter of apology. She stated publicly that an intruder must have been responsible for JonBenét's death and that the family had been unfairly suspected for years. It seemed like vindication. It seemed like proof the Ramseys had been telling the truth all along. But forensic experts across the country strongly disagreed with that exoneration. They argued the DNA evidence Lacey was relying on was essentially meaningless. Touch DNA is exactly what it sounds like. Microscopic amounts of genetic material transferred through casual contact. We leave DNA everywhere we go. On everything we touch. The DNA found on JonBenét's clothing was such a small amount that it could have come from dozens of innocent sources. It could have been deposited during the manufacturing process at the clothing factory. It could have been left by a worker who packaged the underwear. It could have been transferred by a store employee who handled the garment before it was purchased. It could have been from anyone who came into casual contact with that clothing at any point before JonBenét ever wore it. The DNA didn't prove an intruder was in the house that night. It didn't prove anything except that at some point, someone had touched that fabric. Many investigators viewed Lacey's exoneration as politically motivated, an attempt to close a case that had become an embarrassment to Boulder and to shift blame away from the investigation's failures. The exoneration gave the Ramsey family exactly what they needed. A narrative they could point to. Official clearance. But it didn't change what the grand jury had concluded. It didn't erase the evidence of staging. It didn't explain the ransom note or the pineapple or the lies about Burke being asleep. John Ramsey is now in his 80s. He has spent 28 years maintaining his innocence and his family's innocence. He continues to push for further DNA testing using new genetic genealogy techniques that have solved other cold cases. He advocates for the evidence to be sent to independent labs, for the investigation to be handed over to federal authorities, for anything that might finally identify the killer he insists is still out there. He maintains that an intruder murdered his daughter and that his family has been unjustly persecuted by investigators with tunnel vision. Burke Ramsey lived in relative silence until 2016 when he agreed to do his first public interview with Dr. Phil McGraw. The interview was meant to clear his name, to show the world he had nothing to hide. Instead, it raised more questions. Burke's effect was still unusual. He smiled and even laughed when discussing his sister's murder. He admitted he had been downstairs that night playing after everyone else went to bed, directly contradicting the story his parents had told for 20 years. When asked directly if he killed his sister, he said no. When asked if he knew who did, he said he believed it was an intruder. Later that year, CBS aired a documentary special called The Case of JonBenét Ramsey that featured investigators and experts who explicitly laid out the theory that Burke was responsible and his parents had covered it up. Burke sued CBS and the production company for $750 million claiming defamation. The case went through the courts for 3 years before being settled in 2019 for undisclosed terms with no admission of wrongdoing by either side. Burke also sued forensic pathologist Werner Spitz, who had participated in the CBS documentary. That case also settled. But the settlements meant no trial. No evidence presented in court. No testimony given under oath. No depositions made public. The legal maneuvering meant the public still had no definitive answers, only the same questions that had existed for decades. 28 years after that Christmas night, no one has been arrested. No one has been charged. No one has stood trial. The case remains officially unsolved. But the evidence tells a story. The lies tell a story. The 911 call that captured Burke's voice when he was supposed to be asleep tells a story. The pineapple that proved the family's timeline was false tells a story. The ransom note written with materials from inside the house with practice drafts and insider knowledge tells a story. The grand jury indictment that was buried for 14 years tells a story. The refusal to cooperate with police, the immediate hiring of lawyers, the contradictions and evasions and decades of silence, all of it tells a story. And that story isn't about an intruder. It's about a family that made a choice on Christmas night 1996 to protect themselves at all costs. It's about lies that were told in those first 90 seconds of the 911 call and maintained for 28 years. It's about a 6-year-old girl who deserved justice and never got it. The Ramsey family lied. The evidence proves it. And after 28 years, those lies are finally coming out.